The studio lights were hot that night. Tucker Carlson leaned back in his chair, that signature smirk creeping across his face. He'd just delivered what he thought was the kill shot, a mocking, sarcastic monologue about Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. The kind of segment his audience loved. The kind that trended on Twitter within minutes, but then the camera cut to her. Ayanna Pressley, sitting across from him in a remote feed, didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She waited, and when the moment was right, she leaned forward, looked directly into the camera, and said 6 words, just 6. I don't owe you a performance. The studio went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from technical difficulties. The kind that comes from shock. The kind that makes producers touch their earpieces and directors lean closer to their monitors. Tucker's face froze mid-gesture, his hand suspended in the air like someone had hit pause on a remote control. Because those 6 words weren't just a response, they were a mirror, a refusal, a redefinition of the entire conversation. Tucker had spent the last 4 minutes painting Pressley as dramatic, performative, someone playing to the cameras for sympathy. He'd mocked her emotional speech about healthcare, her advocacy for marginalized communities, her very presence in Congress. It was the playbook: diminish, ridicule, dominate, and she dismantled it in 6 words. I don't owe you a performance. She wasn't playing his game. She wasn't giving him the outburst he wanted to clip and replay for days. She wasn't performing the role he'd assigned her: the emotional woman, the radical congresswoman, the perfect villain for his narrative. She was simply refusing to perform at all. The clip went viral within the hour. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because it was surgical, precise, devastating in its simplicity. By the next morning, I don't owe you a performance was trending on 3 continents. Memes flooded Instagram. Think pieces appeared in The Atlantic and Vox. Activists printed it on t-shirts. Teachers showed it in communication classes. It became more than a moment. It became a masterclass. But here's what most people missed. This wasn't a spontaneous comeback. This wasn't a lucky improvisation. Those 6 words were the culmination of a lifetime of refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize, refusing to exist in the narrow boxes others built for her, and to understand why they froze that studio, why they cut through the noise like a blade through silk. You have to understand who Ayanna Pressley was long before she ever sat across from Tucker Carlson. You have to go back. Ayanna Pressley wasn't supposed to be here. Not in Congress, not on national television. Not sitting across from one of the most watched conservative commentators in America, refusing to blink. She was supposed to stay in her lane, stay grateful, stay quiet. But Ayanna Pressley never learned how to stay quiet. She grew up on the north side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep the lights on. She watched her mother navigate a world designed to break women, like her: black women, working class women, women who refused to apologize for taking up space. And she learned early, the world doesn't give you permission. You take it. By her 20s, Pressley was working in Boston politics, climbing a ladder most people didn't think she belonged on. She became the first woman of color elected to the Boston City Council in 2009, not because the system welcomed her, because she refused to wait for an invitation. Her colleagues underestimated her then, too. They thought she'd be grateful just to have a seat at the table. They thought she'd play nice, vote the party line, smile for the cameras, and stay out of the way. Instead, she rewrote the rules. She championed criminal justice reform when it wasn't politically popular. She fought for affordable housing when developers controlled the conversation. She spoke about domestic violence, sexual assault, and systemic racism in chambers that had never heard those words spoken aloud. And when people told her to tone it down, to be more palatable, to stop being so emotional, she leaned in harder. By 2018, she set her sights on Congress. Everyone said it was impossible. Michael Capuano had held the seat for 20 years. He was a Democrat, a liberal, an ally. Primaries like that weren't supposed to happen. You were supposed to wait your turn. But Pressley didn't believe in turns. She ran on a simple, radical message: change can't wait. And she won. Not by playing it safe. Not by softening her edges, but by refusing to perform the version of herself that would make powerful men comfortable. Which brings us back to that studio. Tucker Carlson had done his research, or at least he thought he had. He knew Pressley was part of the squad, the group of progressive congresswomen who'd become lightning rods for conservative media. He knew she gave passionate speeches. He knew she cried on the House floor, talking about families separated at the border. He thought he knew how to break her. He'd done it before, plenty of times. Invite a progressive politician on the show, bait them with sarcasm, watch them get defensive or emotional, then clip the outburst and replay it for days. Frame them as hysterical, irrational, too extreme for mainstream America. It was a formula, and it worked, until it didn't, because Ayanna Pressley had spent her entire life being underestimated by men who thought they had her figured out. Men who thought passion meant weakness, men who thought emotion was the same as instability. And she'd learned something they never expected. The most powerful thing you can do in a fight isn't to fight back harder, it's to refuse the fight entirely. To step outside the frame they've built for you and remind them calmly, clearly, devastatingly, that you don't owe them anything. Not your anger, not your tears, not your performance. When Tucker mocked her that night, he expected a reaction. A defense, an emotional response he could weaponize. Instead, she gave him 6 words. And those 6 words didn't just disarm him, they exposed him. They revealed that the entire segment wasn't about policy or ideas or even disagreement. It was about control. About forcing her into a role she never auditioned for, and she simply ... declined. The internet moves fast. But some moments move faster. Within 30 seconds of Ayanna Pressley saying, "I don't owe you a performance," the first tweet went live. A screenshot of Tucker's frozen face. Caption, "He wasn't ready." Within 3 minutes, the clip was on TikTok. Within 10 minutes, it had 500,000 views. By the time the show ended, it was trending #1 on Twitter in the United States. By morning, it had crossed into Canada, the UK, Australia, Mexico. People who'd never heard of Ayanna Pressley were sharing the clip. People who'd never watched Tucker Carlson were dissecting the moment frame by frame. Because this wasn't just a political moment, it was a cultural one. And the reaction told you everything about who was watching. On the left, it was instant celebration. Queen, iconic, masterclass in composure. Activists and organizers shared it with fire emojis. Teachers posted it with captions like, "This is what boundaries look like." Therapists quoted it in sessions about emotional labor and performative expectations. But it wasn't just progressives. Women across the political spectrum recognized something in that moment. Conservative women, moderate women, women who'd never voted for Pressley and never would. They saw a woman refusing to perform emotion for a man who demanded it. And they understood. Because they'd been there. In boardrooms where male colleagues expected them to smile more. In family dinners where uncles expected them to stay quiet. In relationships where partners expected them to manage their anger. Their joy, their very existence to make someone else comfortable. "I don't owe you a performance" wasn't just about politics, it was about power. About who gets to demand what from whom. About the invisible labor women are expected to perform just to exist in spaces that were never designed for them. And Tucker Carlson, frozen speechless, visibly thrown, became the avatar for every man who'd ever been shocked that a woman refused to play along. The memes came fast. Tucker's face, captioned, "When she doesn't respond to your manipulation tactics." Presley's calm expression, captioned, "Main character energy." Side-by-side comparisons with other iconic mic-drop moments in political history. But beneath the humor was something sharper. Communication professors started breaking down the rhetoric. How Presley's choice of words, "I don't owe you," reframed the entire power dynamic. She didn't say, "I won't," or "I refuse." She said, "I don't owe." As if the very premise of his demand was absurd. As if his expectation had no validity to begin with. Linguists pointed out the brilliance of a performance. Not an explanation, not a response, a performance. She named exactly what he wanted from her show, a spectacle, something he could commodify and weaponize. And by naming it, she took away his ability to get it. Meanwhile, conservative media scrambled to respond. Some tried to spin it as rudeness. Congresswoman disrespects host on live television. Others ignored it entirely, hoping it would fade. A few doubled down, accusing her of being scripted or coached, as if a black woman couldn't possibly be that articulate under pressure without help. But the spin didn't stick. Because the footage was right there. Unedited, undeniable. You could watch Tucker's face shift from smug confidence to genuine confusion in real time. You could see the moment he realized he'd lost control of the narrative. And millions of people did. The clip was played on morning shows, analyzed on cable news, taught in college classrooms. It became a case study in media literacy, emotional intelligence, and the art of refusing to engage with bad faith arguments. But here's what most people still don't know. The story didn't end when the cameras turned off. In fact, what happened in the days and weeks after that 6-word response was, in many ways, even more revealing. Because Tucker Carlson doesn't like to lose. And he definitely doesn't like to lose on camera. 3 days after the moment went viral, Tucker Carlson did something unusual. He didn't mention it, not on his show. Not on social media, not in any interview or public statement. For a man whose brand was built on never backing down, never apologizing, never letting a challenger have the last word, the silence was deafening. His producers tried to move on. They booked new guests, chased new controversies, fed the machine that demanded fresh outrage every 24 hours. But the internet doesn't forget. And it definitely doesn't let you forget when you've been publicly disarmed by 6 words. The comments section under every new video became a graveyard of the same question. Where's the Ayanna Pressley response? He never gave one, because what could he say? Any response would validate the moment. Any attempt to reframe it would replay the clip. Any mockery would look defensive. So he did the only thing a man like Tucker Carlson could do when he loses on camera. He pretended it never happened. But Ayanna Pressley didn't need him to respond. She'd already won. Not because she destroyed him or owned him or any of the other language the internet uses to describe conflict. She won because she refused to let the conflict define her. She didn't spend the next week doing victory laps on cable news. She didn't write op-eds about the moment. She didn't monetize it or turn it into a brand. She went back to work. Back to fighting for criminal justice reform. Back to advocating for healthcare access. Back to the unglamorous, exhausting work of being a congresswoman representing people who rarely see themselves reflected in power. And that, more than anything, proved her point. She didn't owe Tucker Carlson a performance, and she didn't owe the internet one either. But the moment kept living. Months later, women were still quoting those 6 words. In job interviews, when asked invasive questions. In family gatherings, when pressured to explain their choices. In relationships, when expected to manage someone else's emotions. I don't owe you a performance became shorthand for something deeper. A boundary, a refusal. A reminder that you don't have to justify your existence to people who've already decided not to understand you. Communication coaches started teaching it. Not the exact phrase, but the principle behind it. How to identify when someone is demanding emotional labor. How to recognize performative expectations. How to say no without apology. And slowly, quietly, it started changing conversations. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in pockets. In small rebellions, in moments when someone realized they could simply decline the role they'd been assigned. Because that's the thing about viral moments. The ones that last aren't the loudest or the most dramatic. They're the ones that name something people already felt but didn't have language for. Tucker Carlson thought he was hosting a debate. He thought he was exposing a radical congresswoman, dismantling her arguments, making her look foolish in front of millions. What he actually did was create a mirror. A mirror that showed exactly how much of political media is performance. How much of it is about forcing people into roles villain, victim, hero, fool and watching them play the part. And Ayanna Pressley looked into that mirror and said, no, not with anger, not with a lecture. Just with clarity. 6 words, 28 letters, one undeniable truth. So here's what we're left with. Not a story about who won or who lost. Not a cautionary tale about media or politics or gender dynamics, though it's all of those things. But a reminder that the most radical thing you can do in a world that demands your performance is to simply refuse. To exist on your own terms. To recognize that you don't owe anyone, not a talk show host, not the algorithm, not the culture itself, a version of yourself designed for their comfort. Ayanna Pressley knew that long before she sat in that studio. And now, millions of people know it too.